Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll go ahead and get started today. It's nice to see such a wide range of and diversity in our participants today. Thanks for joining us. We have folks from Tanzania and Nigeria, the Netherlands, the US, and many more. So we're happy that you were all able to join us today. Today, we'll be sharing insights that have emerged from behavioral experiments that we recently conducted with health professionals to explore how we might be able to nudge the family planning workforce to share their knowledge and experiences with implementing family planning programs. We are providing live French interpretation during this webinar. If you'd like to listen in French, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then click on French. You'll then have the option to mute the original audio in English, so you won't hear that in the background. You may also select whether or not you would like to read captions during the session. You should be seeing those captions automatically. If not, you can select them by clicking on the icon with the two C's at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you wish to hide the captions later, please select the same icon again and select Hide Subtitle from the menu that appears. These captions are generated using an automatic feature in Zoom, and so they might not be 100% accurate. And on the Zoom platform, captions are only available in English at this time. So my name is Ruwaida Salem. I'm a senior program officer at the Center for Communication Programs at Johns Hopkins. And I'm also the Knowledge Solutions team lead for the Knowledge Success Project. And this is where I manage and support a number of different knowledge management products and activities for the global family planning community, including FP Insight, learning circles, and the pitch, to name a few. I'm joined today by my Knowledge Success colleague, Mariam Youssef, an associate with the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. Mariam has supported and led the design and implementation of behavioral research and interventions for a range of projects, from social investment and financial inclusion to healthcare and agricultural resilience. We're also excited to have a distinguished panel of guest speakers join us today to discuss the findings from our experiments and provide their insights on how these findings can be applied in the family planning community's knowledge management work. So we have with us today Afifa Abdulrahman, the Senior Gender Advisor and Team Lead for the Gender Portfolio in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health at USAID. Afifa has over 19 years of experience working on social and behavior change and gender integration for reproductive health programs. She holds a master's degree in international development studies from George Washington University and a bachelor's in political science and history from the University of Rochester. We also have with us Neela Saldana, Executive Director at the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale, where her mission is to develop the science of scaling interventions for development. Neela has deep expertise in the behavioral sciences field and has applied those skills in both the social sector and in the private sector, where she led teams in marketing, strategy, and sales at companies like Nestle and Unilever. Neela was mentioned in Forbes magazine as one of 10 behavioral scientists you should know. She has a PhD in marketing from the Wharton School and University of Pennsylvania, and an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta, India. And we also have with us Anne Ballard-Sarah, Senior Program Officer at the Center for Communication Programs. Anne works on the Knowledge Success Project with myself, and she supports the implementation of knowledge, innovations, and partnerships. She also leads the Pitch regional competitions that fund KM innovations in family planning and oversees the project's activities in the Asia region. She is also currently working on a series of knowledge exchange events that focus on sharing failure stories in family planning program implementation. Anne holds a Master's of Public Health degree from the George Washington University. But before we take a look at our agenda, I wanted to say just a few words about Knowledge Success for those who may not be as familiar with us. So our project is funded by USAID, and it focuses on knowledge management for family planning programs. A key aspect of our project is to take a new approach that infuses behavioral science principles into knowledge management for family planning programs in order to make knowledge exchange and learning for the family planning workforce relevant, easy, and timely so that they can deliver results in their programs. Part of this work was to undertake some behavioral experiments to explore how we might be able to leverage behavioral nudges to improve knowledge sharing among family planning professionals. And that's why we're here today, to share the findings and insights that emerged from these experiments in the hopes that you will also be able to apply them in your own knowledge management work. So here's the plan for our session today. This webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes. Mariam will start by providing an overview of the experiments. Then she'll also share the results of the experiments in 2 segments. We'll intersperse those 2 segments with a discussion with our panelists on the findings. Then I'll wrap up with some recommendations of how to apply the findings in our collective knowledge management work. And we'll definitely leave some time at the end to take questions from the audience. So even though we're reserving time at the end for questions, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box as we're presenting. Our team members will collect those questions, and if possible, we'll be able to provide immediate responses for you in the chat. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Mariam, to get us started with an overview of the experiments. Mariam, over to you.
Thank you, Ruwaida. Hello, everyone, and welcome. So as Ruwaida has just given the overview, I'll go through the experiments briefly and the objectives. So what we aim to achieve during the research that we conducted. Okay, so it's just to give a bit of context, as Ruwaida has explained, knowledge management really focuses on helping professionals, especially within the FP and planning space, reproductive health and planning space, to curate information more efficiently and to benefit more from the information available. And if you think about knowledge management, we can distill this down to 3 main behaviors, which is seeking information, using information, and sharing information. And for this project, or for the experiments that we conducted, we focused mostly on sharing behavior. So how can we encourage more professionals within the various communities of practice to share more, to be more intentional about sharing information around their programs and how they're implementing their programs. And for our research, our objectives were focused on 3 main areas around sharing. The first being understanding what we can do to motivate sharing behavior. So what kind of behavioral nudges can we use to encourage more professionals to actively share and think more proactively about sharing? The second objective was around gender. So understanding how we can learn more about how people share based on their gender identities and how sharing behavior changes when people are aware of the gender identities of those that they're sharing with. So does it influence sharing behavior? Does it reduce sharing behavior? And how can we leverage on this and learn to make sharing more inclusive and more beneficial for all those within the space? And then finally, understanding how best to encourage health professionals not only to share, but to share information around their failures. We understand that there is so much to learn and gain from the lessons from past programs implemented. And we wanted to understand how can we break down the stigma around sharing failures and not just encourage sharing behavior, but also encourage sharing behavior that can help professionals within the space learn from what has been done in the past, what was not done so well and what was done relatively well. Okay, so we conducted 3 experiments or 3 pieces of research to really explore the objectives that I just discussed. The first experiment was really testing behavioral nudges. We identified a selection of behavioral nudges from literature and from their applications in other spaces and sectors that are quite popular in driving motivation, especially intrinsic motivation around sharing behavior. So we wanted to test this within the context of FP and RH professionals. So we identified some of these nudges, and we wanted to see how well they encourage people to share information, just generic information. The second experiment looked around the stigma attached to failure. So in addition to sharing information, as I mentioned, we also want to encourage sharing around failures. But we all know that as human beings, we tend to shy away from sharing our failures and share more of our successes. And this is natural, this is instinctive. But we were trying to see how can we break down the stigma around the word failure? How can we reinvent the word failure? How can we reframe the ask that we give professionals to share their failures in such a way that it is less negatively perceived and encourages people to be vulnerable enough to share experiences around their failures. So here what we did is that we curated a list of alternative words and phrases that we could use as an alternative to failure in the way that we communicate to professionals and ask them, and in the way that we ask them to share information around their failures. And finally, the last experiment is a little bit of a combination of experiment 1 and 2. With the last experiment, we're also testing behavioral nudges, but within the context of failure. So with the last experiment, we're testing how can behavioral nudges encourage people to share information, but not just any information, to share information around their failures. We also tested a selection of alternative words and phrases that could be used to communicate failure, or the ask that people were given to share their failures. And finally, we also tested the context of sharing failures. Are people more willing to share failures in an interactive session where there's a Q&A activity where they have to not only share their failures, but receive feedback and questions around those failures that they're sharing? So the third experiment tries to assess a combination of things. Number one, nudges. Secondly, the type or the way that we're framing failure. And lastly, the platform or the context within which people are sharing their failures. So within a live Q&A session. And just to give a brief overview of our experimental sample, we recruited, we had a recruitment drive that aimed to gain participants from Africa as well as Asia. So we had this recruitment drive for several months, and after the recruitment drive, we were able to recruit a total of about 1,500 participants. But of those 1,500 that were recruited, about 501 actually participated in our experiments. And we see that most of them were from East Africa, about 70%. And when we look at the balance in terms of gender identities, we see that we have a fairly even split between those who identify as men and women. And we see this across the 3 different experiments that we conducted. Okay, so before we go into the results, we just wanted to state some of the limitations of our work. As you know, research is an iterative process. It's just a snapshot at a point in time. And there are so many variables that are at play when you're conducting experimental research. So you will always have some form of limitations. And these are just a few of what we came across during our research. The first is attrition. So as you can imagine, we recruited about, almost, 1,500 people to engage in this experiment, but unfortunately only about a little over 500 participated, which is normal. It is usually the case in research that you'll have a little bit of fall off, just because of the timing, the availability of people to engage. So this meant that our sample size was not as large as we had hoped, but we still were able to derive some good results from our assessment. And then another element of the research that we considered was the balance between the demographics of people that we recruited. Although we had a fairly good balance between genders, so those who identified as men and those who identified as women, and we were very open in our recruitment process, and we encouraged all people who identified it, no matter what their gender identities, we encouraged a large spectrum of people to engage and participate. But unfortunately, we did see that most of our participants were from East Africa, so we weren't able to get as many from Asia. However, we were able to deduce some great insights from the balance of participants that we did get. And lastly, significance. So we usually try to assess the significance of our results at a particular level or a particular standard. So most of our findings were significant at a 10% level, which is mostly considered borderline significance, which is good because it shows that our results are indicative of some effect, but it just goes to show that our significance levels aren't at the highest levels, propagated in research. Okay, so moving on to the results. So we'll start with the first experiment. And with this experiment, as you would recall, we are looking purely at behavioral nudges, but we also try to break down our findings based on gender. So based on how the participants identified, we tried to break down and see what the effects were across the different gender identities. So the first line of our results show the impact of the behavioral nudges. So we tested social norms and we tested recognition. So social norms is very popular in behavioral science literature. It's very well known, it's widely leveraged, and it basically speaks to the notion or the idea that people are influenced by their peers and by the behavior of those around them. So the descriptive norms or how people are, what is acceptable behavior in their society informs how people behave. So we wanted to test how social norms can influence the motivation of people to share information. And the second behavioral nudge that we try to test is recognition as an incentive. So there are many non-monetary and monetary incentives that can be tested, but in the field of knowledge management, we try to limit the extent of monetary incentives. So we wanted to test a non-monetary incentive, which was just social recognition. How do people respond, or how do people share when they know that they'll be recognized for their sharing behavior? The second layer of the results showed how people respond to gender priming. So how do people respond when they know the gender identity of those that they will be sharing information with? So we divided this into two buckets. We have same gender priming and different gender priming. So same gender priming, for example, would be the case of, for example, a woman who is told that her partner or the person that they would be sharing with is also a woman. How does sharing behavior differ when they're also told that the partner they will be sharing is of a different gender identity, for example, a male or a man? So that's the second layer of our experimental results. And then finally, we try and look at how these results differ based on the gender identity of those who are sharing. So for example, are women more likely to share more than men? And how does this differ across the different behavioral nudges?
Okay.
So with our first experiment,
Avec notre première expérience.
Okay. So with the first experiment, we have the treatments laid out on the screen so that you can see quite clearly.
Clairement.
So with the social norms treatment, the messages that participants received during a game. So participants were asked to play a game and they were paired with a partner or a hypothetical partner. And in that game, participants were asked to answer a set of quiz questions with their partner. And these quiz questions were related to public health. And participants during the quiz were given pieces of information and given the option to either keep that information to themselves or share the information with their partner. And participants were randomly assigned to the different groups that we were testing. So for example, participants were randomized into the social norms, the recognition, the same gender or different gender treatments, or they were randomized into the control groups. So the control group 1 is that they didn't receive any gender priming, and control group 2, they didn't receive any behavioral nudges. So this is an example of a very basic randomized controlled trial where we're comparing the outcomes of a treatment group versus a control group. Now, during the game, as participants played this quiz game, the social norms treatments were asked, do you want to share your information with your partner? Most other participants taking this assessment choose to share information with their partner. In the recognition treatment, participants were told, would you like to share information with your partner? We will let your partner know that you have chosen to share information with them if you choose to share. In the same gender group, what we did was to prime the participants on the name of their partner. So for example, if we wanted to prime them on the same gender partner and the participant was a woman, we would say that your partner is Elena or Anna or Susan. So by giving them the name of their partner, we were indirectly priming them on the gender identity of their partner. And the same goes for the different gender group. So for example, if I was a participant, I would be primed that my partner was Philip or Matthew. So I was indirectly being primed that my partner was identified as a man. So this is just an overview of how the treatment groups were assigned and how the treatment groups differed. So now when we look at the findings, we first of all broke the findings by behavioral nudges. So we wanted to see what behavioral nudge out of social norms and recognition was the most effective in improving or motivating participants to share information. And what we find is that those participants that were in the social norms category, so those who were primed of the fact that their peers or other professionals in the same circumstances usually chose to share information with their partner, we found that there was a 9 percentage point increase in the number of people who chose to share. So we find that when we compare this to those who didn't receive a social norms priming, we see that social norms does have a significantly positive impact on improving the motivation to share and actual sharing behavior. We also looked at the gender angle or the gender perspective of this finding. So we wanted to understand, so among those who were in the social norms treatment group, were men more likely to share or were women more likely to share? And we found that under the social norms treatment, when given a second chance to share, so when they played the game a second time, so after playing the game once, playing the game the second time, we found that the percentage of women who shared was 26 percentage points less than men. So what we find overall is that although both men and women share more when they're given the first chance to share information with their partner, we find that repeated sharing behavior is not consistent for both men and women. So when they're asked to play the game again and they're primed with social norms, we find that slightly less women share compared to men. We also tried to distill the effect of recognition. So recognition being honoring those who chose to share by recognizing them among their partner. And we've observed no significant effect among participants that were informed that they would be recognized for their sharing behavior. Now, this could be due to several factors. It could be due to the fact that recognition on its own may not be sufficient enough to motivate people to share. There are other variables that come into play as well, given our sample size. It could be that if we looked at a much larger sample size, we may have seen a different result. Now looking at how people respond to gender identity priming. Again, just to go over this again. So with the gender identity priming treatment, participants were primed on the gender identity of those that they would be sharing with. And what we find is that at the first chance women were given to share information during the game, there were 18 percentage points more women who actually shared with their partner when they knew their partner was a woman. So what this means is that when women were aware that the gender identity of those that they were sharing with was the same as theirs, so they were both women, they shared more. We didn't observe any significant effects of same gender sharing behavior in the subsequent rounds. So we only observed this effect during the first round of the game, but during subsequent rounds, when both men and women were repeatedly asked to share again and again during the quiz, we didn't see any effect. So we see that the initial gut reaction during the first session of the game is that women tend to share more when they know the gender identity of their partner is also a woman. Okay, so I'll pause here for the panel discussion, but happy to go over any elements of that first segment to clarify.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you so much for walking us through those findings and what we found in an experimental setting when it comes to information sharing. Now I'd like to invite our panelists to discuss these findings in light of what they've seen and experienced in other settings, including the real world. So I'll start first with Neela. Neela, from the experiment we ran, it seems like social norms related behavioral nudges encouraged information sharing, but incentives like personal recognition did not. Were these findings surprising to you, or are they in line with what you would have expected and what you've seen in other settings?
Thank you, Ruwaida. I do want to, before I discuss these findings, I do want to make a really important point that kudos to the whole team who put this together. There isn't enough information, behavioral experimentation that's done in knowledge management in general, what promotes information sharing, and particularly in the global South, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, where more than 85% of the world's population is. So I think this is a critical first step, and I hope we see many more experiments, many more tests like this all over. Having said that, it's really interesting to me that social norms or social proof, the idea that giving people explicit information that other people are doing this activity, I think that's really interesting that it promoted information sharing in this case. We've seen that work in a number of cases, from recycling. When you tell people other people are recycling towels in a hotel, people are more likely to recycle, to energy use. I've seen that on my own electricity bill when we get information that your neighbors are using this much electricity, even to farmers when they're trying to adopt sustainable farming practices, if you tell them that other farmers are doing that. So it's really interesting to see it get played out in this information sharing domain as well. And I would say it's a broader point to maybe it's interesting to pursue all these social angles. So it does seem like people don't have a barrier to sharing information. They just don't think it's important or other people are doing it. And when you actually maybe give them that information, they might be more they might be more likely to say, oh yeah, I should. They don't have any real sort of barrier to share other than maybe they just think no one's doing it. On recognition, on the incentives, the results there in the behavioral science literature, I think, are quite mixed. On one hand, they work quite well, both financial and, as in this case, non-financial incentives. But sometimes they don't. In a recent mask trial that we conducted in Bangladesh to promote community mask wearing during COVID, we give both financial and non-financial incentives at the village level, and that just didn't promote mask wearing. So neither financial nor non-financial recognition, very similar, actually helped. And so a couple of things I think about incentives. I think it's good to know that they're not the silver bullet, and we shouldn't jump to that as the first solution to anything. I think it's, one of the lessons I'm taking from this experiment. Of course, Mariam was very clear and transparent about sample size. So that's certainly something we have to think about. But also maybe we need to make, if we do something around recognition, maybe it needs to be stronger. Maybe just giving people very subtle information may not change. But if we try something where we maybe told them that they were going to be, celebrated for this, that might be an interesting way to look at it. But certainly, I think the key coming out of this, or what I would take forward, is that let's really explore this area of social and social norms and social proof to provide information sharing, not just through the specific experiment that the team did, but other ways of telling people other people are doing this, make it more normalized. And in terms of incentives, we've got to be, maybe more explicit about it, but it's not the silver bullet that we're expecting.
Now, thank you for that, Neela. Those are really great insights, and the idea about just being a lot more explicit with the types of incentives or recognition that we give is, I think, a really, really great one, because yes, I agree that it was very subtle in the experiments that we ran. So thank you for that. I'd like to dig into the gender-related findings a bit more with you, Afifa. So past research has shown that people have a tendency to want to spend time with other people like them, and that includes people of the same gender. And this also plays out in the workplace too. And we're talking here specifically about the family planning workforce. So we're talking about the program managers and technical advisors, the service providers. So the experiments we ran confirm this phenomenon of people wanting to spend time and share information with people of the same gender identity. So can you share with us some practical examples of how this might play out among the global family planning workforce?
Thank you, Ruwaida. Really great question. And thank you, Mariam, for presenting all of those findings. So fascinating. I think this concept, otherwise known as gender homophily, is a fascinating concept. And, in some contexts, it's stronger for women, and in some contexts, it's stronger for men. But this tendency for people to prefer to interact with people of the same gender identity can have, I think, different ramifications for women and men, or any gender identity for that matter. The tendency, I think, when we think about examples, it can act as a barrier to women's ability to access knowledge within an organization if they are excluded from male-dominated groups. So if you think about the health workforce, which is right now 70% women, but in leadership roles, they only hold about an estimated 25% of senior roles. So if you think about that, although women dominate in the family planning and reproductive health workforce, when it comes to leadership, the networks and the networking that need to be done in order for people to advance their work objectives and that are important for achieving these work objectives, women have to figure out, well, how do I navigate this? How do I navigate leadership where I'm in male-dominated a male-dominated context, and so often they may be excluded from these informal networks that are dominated by men, and they may lose out on valuable information and social capital that can help them work more effectively. So I think it's important to remember that women and men have different viewpoints and ideas and approaches to solving problems. And I think research has also shown that gender diverse teams perform better than single gender teams. So when we think about this concept of gender homophily, or wanting to interact with people of the same gender, it not only impacts on women's ability to do their work effectively, especially within the leadership space, but also it can limit men's access to and engagement with the diverse knowledge and unique perspectives of women and individuals of other gendered identities. So I think for this concept, some practical examples of how that may work out or pan out with respect to health or the health workforce, and in particular the family planning workforce are around women being in leadership roles and having to deal with this boys or old boys network, but also men losing out on women's perspectives.
Now, thanks for that, Afifa. I think the family planning workforce and specifically is really unique and interesting because, as you mentioned, we are very much a women-dominated field in many spaces and many areas, but I think we can still see that in many leadership positions, we still have men dominating some of those positions. So very great insights. Thank you so much, Nila and Afifa, for sharing that with us. I'd like to turn it back over to Mariam now to present the next set of findings around our other experiments, and then we'll come back to a discussion with our panelists.
Great. Thank you, Ruwaida, and thank you, Nila and Afifa. That was really intriguing and very great points made. Looking forward to digging into the next set of experiments. Okay, so with the second experiment, we're going to look at what we did around failures. So just to recap, the first experiment focused on behavioral nudges. So how can we motivate sharing behavior through the use of behavioral nudges? The second experiment was purely looking at how can we reframe failure in such a way that it is perceived as less negative, and really encourage people to feel comfortable around sharing their failures and kind of build a culture around information sharing, particularly around failures. So what we did was we had the same group of participants that engaged in the behavioral nudges experiment engage in a word association game that kind of was derived from an implicit association test, but this was much simpler and much more direct. And what we did was we basically wanted to understand, how people categorize alternative framing or alternative words and phrases to failure, whether they categorize them as being more positive or more negative. And we did this for the global health professionals that participated, so both our Asian and Sub-Saharan African participants. Okay, so we curated, with Knowledge Success, with Ruwaida and the lovely people at Knowledge Success, it was really a team effort. We curated a list of alternative words and phrases to failure, and this curated list was really based on literature. It was based on sort of pairing different alternative framings for failure based on what has been used in the past within knowledge management, and just some new pairings that we wanted to test. And we provided, we basically presented this list sequentially to participants, and they had to categorize them as positive or negative, but it was very implicit. So they had to do it very quickly. They only had like a few seconds. It was really their gut reaction to these words. And this was done online. So once the participants received the link, they started the assessment, and basically each of these words appeared on their screen one after the other, and they had to quickly, select positive or negative. So you can tell that we have a couple of odd words in there just to test, their comprehension and just to see if they're being carried along. But these were the majority of words that we tested, and we categorized them based on their percentages. So the percentages of words that were perceived as the most positive versus the percentage of words that were perceived as the least positive. And we can see that, learnings, opportunity, growth, learning opportunities, reflections for growth, lessons learned, adaptation, professional reflections, these were some of the words that came to the top of our word association game. So these are the kinds of words that people connected with most and resonated with people when they think around sharing failures or when they think about failures in general. These were the kinds of words and phrases that, invoked a sense of positivity and a sense of salience around, sharing failures. So after the word association game, we had a second layer of our experiment, which was trying to test a combination of behavioral nudges and also a selection of alternative words and phrases that came up that ranked the highest during our word association game. So we selected 3 words that we felt were quite intuitive and ranked fairly well, and that also participants understood quite well, because our participants were from Anglophone Africa and also Saxophone, French-speaking Africa and English-speaking Africa. So we wanted to ensure that the words that we use or the phrases that we used were understood well in, in the respective context. So with the behavioral nudges, we also tested social norms. We tested incentives as well, but we had an additional social nudge that we tested, which is self-efficacy. And self-efficacy just means here ability. So most of the time, people may shy away from engaging in a behavior or desired behavior because they just don't feel they are, they have the know-how, or they feel they're confident enough to engage in that behavior. And with self-efficacy, we wanted to encourage or provide support to those who were in this treatment. So we offered them the opportunity to, have, public speaking lessons and, coaching lessons on how they can share information or share their failures in a more confident and in more optimal manner. We also tested the impact of Q&A sessions. So there are many platforms and many ways in which people can share information. You can share information anonymously through email, through online platforms. You can share information in person, with direct engagement with people. So we wanted to see how live Q&A sessions work. And this kind of ties in with some of the solutions that Knowledge Success is creating and has created around learning circles and in allowing professionals to share information in groups of people. So we wanted to see how well people would respond to this opportunity to share information in a Q&A session, or what I would like to call an interactive session. So with the words that we chose to test, we chose to test improving through failure as an alternative to failure. We also wanted to test what works and what doesn't, which is, I would say, Knowledge Success favorite. It's been used in the past. We also wanted to see how it would fare during the experiments. And we also wanted to test lessons learned from failure as an alternative to failure. And the way this experiment was deployed online through an email. So all the participants that participated in the first experiment were essentially shared an email inviting them to participate in a knowledge sharing exercise or a learning circles exercise or a learning event. And they were all randomized into different treatment groups. So the first treatment group is the social norms group. And here the emails were framed in such a way that they told the recipients that more and more professionals like you are sharing their failures to help others improve their global health programs. So that's the social norms treatment. The encouraging self-efficacy treatment, or improving the ability of people to share failures, read, we will provide a simple template for you to follow that makes sharing your failures easier. We can also offer coaching on how to speak to a public audience about failure so you feel more comfortable sharing. The incentives treatment read, if you choose to share your failures, you will be included in a raffle to have your registration costs for the upcoming 2020 International Conference on Family Planning covered. So this incentive was a monetary incentive, whereas the first incentive that we tested was a non-monetary incentive. And the ICFP is, one of the, is a very profound conference, and a lot of professionals look forward to going to it. So we thought that it would be a great incentive to offer. The last experiment was, or the last treatment on Q&A read, this session will include time for an interactive question and answer session with other participants attending the session. And then, of course, we had a counterfactual or a control group where we didn't provide any behavioral nudges and we didn't provide any incentives. We just told them, we would like to invite you to share your failures. This can be something that you have experienced personally or from other programs. And we would like you, or programs that you're familiar with. So it's just a blanket request for the participants to share their failures. And this was all sent via email. And in the email response, they could select whether they wanted to engage or not engage in sharing their failures. So we were measuring intention to share failures in this experiment. So the impact of changing the term failure. So as you recall, we tested these 3 terms: improving through failure, what works and what doesn't, lessons learned from failure. And this is just an example of how we incorporated these terms into our emails. So for example, with improving through failure, we wrote, we would like to invite you to share your experiences of improving through failure. With what works and what doesn't, we simply said, we would like you to share what works and what doesn't. And with lessons learned from failure, we simply asked, we would like to invite you to share lessons learned from failure. So very simple renderings of these words that we used in the various email treatments that we sent out. And we also wanted to make sure that, the participants understood what we meant by the alternatives to failure that we gave in the various email treatments. So we did have a comprehension check, just to make sure that the participants understood the words that we were, the framing that we were using. And we also wanted to check the percentage of participants who said the term had a positive connotation. So you can see the word failure on its own is the least positive. And we see that improving through failure was considered the most positive. And the runners-up were lessons learned from failure and what works and what doesn't. So just the play on words and the play on framing, by just simply stating failure as improving through failure, has a dramatically, larger impact on perception than just using the word failure on its own. So it really shows the power of framing and how we can leverage framing in communication. So what were the results? So when we assessed the impact or the outcomes of intention to share failures based on what framing the participants received, we only found a positive impact for improving through failure. So all those participants that received the email that stated or asked them to share information around improving through failure rather than just using the word failure, we found that they were predicted, they were more likely to share information or more likely to demonstrate an intention to share. And we found that this predicted to improve intention to share by about 20 percentage points. And we didn't find any significant effects for the alternatives, lessons learned from failure and what works. Not necessarily because they aren't impactful, but again, sample size also played into our results. And possibly with a larger sample size, we may be able to see differing effects for these other terms. Interestingly, when we try to observe the impact of behavioral nudges on intention to share failures, we didn't see any significant effect of all our behavioral nudges, including social norms. So including the priming that we gave, telling the participants that other professionals also share their failures. And this could be due to a number of reasons. But one thing that we observed is that during the course of our experiments, as we transitioned from experiment 1 to experiment 2, and finally to the 3rd experiment, we did see a lot more participants dropping off. So this also could play in why we didn't see any significant results in our behavioral nudges outcomes. But there is scope to really assess this on a much larger scale and seeing how we can distill the differences between these behavioral nudges with a much larger sample size. And finally, the effect of Q&As. So with this treatment, we really just wanted to understand how best can we encourage people to share failures. So what context or what platform would be conducive or comfortable for people to share their failures. And we wanted to test interactive Q&A sessions. So not just sharing information anonymously, but actually engaging with other people or a group of people and being able to interact and respond to their critique or their feedback around your failures, and not just sharing failures and just, leaving it at that. And what we find is that for those people that we asked to engage in a live Q&A session, we found that participants who agreed to share were 26 percentage points less compared to those who were not told that they would be involved in a live Q&A. And what this just basically means is that the intention to share reduces when people feel they have to share their failures in an interactive or large interactive setting. We didn't specify how many other people would be in this interactive session, so that was discretionary. So the participants were left to think, to make up their minds on, how large that setting would be. But it could be the case that maybe having much smaller settings, and the panel will probably discuss this in a little bit, maybe trying to customize these interactive sessions so that people who feel comfortable sharing with a smaller group have that opportunity, and people who feel comfortable sharing with a much larger group also have that opportunity, rather than bundling everyone into one Q&A or interactive session. So these are the outcomes from the second and third experiment, and I'll hand over to Ruwaida to kick off the final panel session.
Great, thank you so much, Mariam. So much information there to unpack about sharing of failures, which has been a really hot topic in our field for some time now. And we know that family planning professionals have said that they want the field to share more of their failures to avoid repeating past mistakes, but there are obviously some clear barriers to doing so. So from our experiments, it seems like we weren't able to find any evidence of behavioral nudges to promote sharing of failures, but there was some indication that the words we use to describe failures can make a difference. So I'd like to start this discussion by asking my colleague, Anne, my first question. Anne, you've been running some knowledge exchange sessions among family planning professionals recently, and to do exactly what we're talking about, to encourage them to share their failures. So tell us about your experience. Have people warmed up to this idea?
Thank you for the question, Ruwaida, and thank you for the great presentation of the results, Mariam. So as Ruwaida mentioned, we're partnering with the WHO IBP network to host a series of 3 virtual knowledge exchange events leading up to an in-person event that will happen at ICFP. And the first 2 failure exchange events were part of the IBP network's global partners meeting. But this 3rd event will be virtual and it will be open to the public. It will be happening later this summer. So please stay tuned for an invitation, and I hope to see you all there. But what we have found is that people are definitely warming up to this idea, and it is something that we have seen on Knowledge Success, that those working in family planning and reproductive health really do want to be talking about what's also not working as well as what is working. So in the first knowledge exchange event that we had, we tried to lay the foundation for why it's important to talk about our failures and how it's important to learn from them. We also addressed some of the self-efficacy components that Mariam discussed. So for example, we started with 2 peers modeling the behavior of sharing a failure that they were personally involved in. So Megan Christofield from Japaigo shared a story, as well as Pranab Rajmandari from CCP Nepal. And then we also shared a template that would help people figure out what components to include when they do share their own story. And we also shared some tips for sharing failures. Our second event also included some prominent donors modeling the behavior of sharing failures. So we heard from Rajani Ved from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gertrude Odezugu from USAID at the Nigeria Mission. And then we put participants into small groups of 3, and they had 2 minutes to share their own failure, and then 5 minutes for the other 2 people in that group to have a discussion about that failure. For the discussion portion, we leveraged a technique or an approach by Ashley Good, who is the CEO of a program called Fail Forward. And we used what she calls curious questions to guide the discussion. And curious questions help the person that's sharing better understand their own story and learn from it so that they can incorporate those learnings into their work. So some example curious questions are, why do you think this story is meaningful to share? Or how has your understanding of this experience changed since it happened? And we found that this is really a topic of interest to a lot of people working in family planning and reproductive health, but we also did find that people dropped off of the call. Some people dropped off of the call when it came time for them to share their own failures. So I think reiterating the importance of learning from our failures, giving people multiple formats through which to share their failures, and having these conversations more often so that it becomes a norm will help reduce drop-off in future events. But those who did stay and participate in the entirety of the event, we heard really great feedback that they were really surprised to see that even though their failures and experiences were different, the challenges and the lessons learned were very similar. And people also felt comforted knowing that others at other organizations are facing similar challenges and barriers as well.
That's really insightful, Anne. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, we obviously all are experiencing failures. Nothing's perfect in this world, of course. So it's great to see that people are warming up to the idea. So based on the findings from the experiment we ran, is there anything that you would do differently in future sessions?
Good question. So I think choosing the title of your event is really important. And we specifically titled ours, Oops, Aha, Failures in FP Program Implementation. We did want to keep the word failure in there because we're trying to make it a norm. But we thought that the oops would signify that something, a barrier or a challenge or a failure happened, but the aha would really highlight that learning occurred from that. And after the assessment, when we saw the findings, we also titled the breakout activity where people were sharing their own stories. We titled that Improving Through Failure, since that seemed to resonate with a lot of people. So I think leveraging the study findings is a good suggestion. And even though, as Miriam discussed, 26% said that they would be less likely if there was a Q&A portion involved, we knew that we still wanted it to be interactive to really strengthen that knowledge exchange component of learning from our failures. So once we knew that a Q&A could be perceived as a barrier, we were able to design around it. And that's why we incorporated those curious questions. And we created a handout of those curious questions that could guide people during that discussion. And I think it's just important to note that the curious questions were not to problem solve or finger point or blame or dive deeper into the problem, but they were really meant to provide insight into the person sharing that failure so that they could learn from it and then incorporate that into their work.
I really love that framing, the curious questions. I think it just changes your whole mind about thinking about the failures. So thanks for that. I appreciate that. So gender was a big part of this experiment as well. So I want to turn to you, Afifa, to provide some context to the gender-related findings from this experiment. And so one of the things that we tested was whether women would be less likely to share their failures if they had to take questions from the audience. And this was, based on past research that found that women presenters get more questions and more hostile or patronizing questions at conferences than men do. So Afifa, I'm sure you've been to your fair share of meetings and conferences with the family planning workforce. Do you find there's a tendency for women to face more critical analysis of their work than men? And if so, do you think it dissuades women from wanting to share their experiences with the family planning community?
Yeah, that's another great question. So, I mentioned in the previous comments how the family planning workforce is primarily women. So it's when you think about these, one, I don't necessarily have the data or actual data to say yet to answer that question. But anecdotally, when you think about it, your own experiences and your experiences in meetings and in conferences, again, you're sort of surrounded by women. So it's kind of sort of hard to sort of base your experience on that to answer that question. But I will say that that would be a very interesting issue to explore and examine in more detail. There is literature that demonstrates that women in a particular context were 1.4 times more likely to receive critical subjective feedback than men, as opposed to whether, you know, positive or critical objective feedback. And this is for their performance reviews. So there's gender bias, and there was also the notation that gender bias could be the cause of this, and that which leads to double standards for women. So there is this element that women, you know, if you sort of think about women in the context of facing critical analysis, this is what, you know, a lot of women have to deal with. So I think gender norms with respect to sharing failures and sharing critical or engaging in critical analysis about someone's work, I think it really is contextual. I think it's about the culture, it's about the context, it's about the particular meeting. You know, Anne talked about how with the OOPS, with their learning circle, she was able to establish norms within that particular safe space to say that, okay, sharing failures is what we're here to do. It's a safe space. This is, you know, there is nothing wrong with this, and you should actually want to do it because it helps improve your work. So I think it's about context, and then also about culture. What are the gender norms on sharing failures? Are men okay with being vulnerable? Are there stereotypes that women have to deal with about not performing if they're sharing their failures? And are seen to be not performing because they failed. You know, is critical analysis welcomed by both women and men, and also this idea that women have a tendency to discuss more or be able to do deeper analysis than men when they're in these contexts. Would that also contribute to women being more apt to talk about failures than men? I think, and so even though the findings from the experiment showed that there weren't that many differences, I think, again, it's all contextual. And so like this bias that we have, I think it's everywhere, but in the context of the family planning workforce, I think we should not only take a gendered lens to this, but also an intersectional lens. If we think, you know, to take this intersectional lens to any examination of dynamics of how information is shared, including information about failures. I would add to your question, Ruwaida, that, you know, is there a tendency for women researchers and practitioners from low and middle income countries or the global South to face more critical analysis of their work than women in high income countries or the global North? And what happens if you add other aspects of people's identities into this equation, like ethnicity and race, location? So I think it's important to frame, I think it's also important to draw attention to how we frame these failures in you know, specifically drawing or going back to what Miriam said. In her presentation, she showed how that the framing of the concept was important to people. So maybe if we shape our framing in a way that is more positive and more constructive, that may encourage both women and men to share more. And also, again, establishing the norms of these safe spaces, and, you know, in the way that we work, that it's okay to do this. It's what we should do. This is how we learn. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but there's a lot to unpack when it comes to the gender space, and a lot that we don't know.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks, Afifa. You bring up like 10 more great points for us to dig into. You know, context is very important. Culture and the intersectional lens, of course, is also a very important issue. So thank you for raising that in this space as well. So a big thank you to all of our guest panelists for sharing their insights. And in our final segment of our presentation, I'm going to just go over some brief overall recommendations based on these experiments before we move into the open Q&A portion with our audiences, where we can take your questions and answer them. So our first set of recommendations relate to motivating increased information sharing. So based on the findings from our experiments, we recommend incorporating social norms or social proofing into key messages to encourage uptake and initial use of knowledge management solutions that require information sharing. So as a very concrete example, if you're familiar with FP Insight, it's a platform that Knowledge Success recently launched within the past year. And it's a space where users can collect, organize, and share important family planning resources in one central location. So one way that we can incorporate social norms or social proofing is to let potential users of FP Insight know that many of their peers are on the platform and encourage them to sign up and to start sharing information as well. So one specific example is in our communications messages, we can share that more than 700 of your peers in family planning have joined FP Insight, and to encourage them to also become FP Insight members. Another way to implement this social norms framing is to share user testimonials, or in the case of interactive KM events, participant testimonials, to let other family planning professionals know how peers like them are benefiting from the knowledge management platform or activity or event. Our second recommendation is related to our finding that women and men were more likely to share information with someone of the same gender. So to account for these tendencies, it's really important that we ensure a balanced mix of gender identities in information sharing activities, especially in events that depend on people sharing information with each other. And I think this is something that our field is already aware of in general, but it's important for us to make sure that this is at the forefront of our minds when we design and host events. And beyond that, we can also work to create spaces where mixed gender groups can feel comfortable sharing information with each other, especially in interactive virtual events where we all feel a little bit more awkward in the virtual space than it is in when we're in person together. So one way to do this is that you could provide like prompts to kickstart conversations, especially when you move people into breakout rooms. And so it might be a little uncomfortable starting that conversation. And finally, we can also do our part to shift some of the norms around gender homophily, or the tendency for people to want to interact and share with people of the same gender identity. So for example, during events, when we create ground rules with our participants, one of those ground rules can be that all participants are equals and have something useful to contribute, regardless of their gender identity, their geographic location, their job role, or any other identity. And we can be very explicit about these gender homophily tendencies, and that our goal is to counter these tendencies to ensure diversity in perspectives and the solutions that we come up with. And finally, while our experiments did not show a significant effect on recognition-based incentives on information sharing behavior, it could be that there are other types of incentives that may resonate more with family planning professionals. So for example, maybe it's certificates, and that's the kind of recognition that they're really looking for, or something else. Therefore, we recommend conducting some qualitative studies across regions to identify other forms of incentives that may appeal more to family planning professionals in their own contexts. Our next set of recommendations focus on encouraging people to share their failures with each other. So sharing failures is much harder than sharing successes for obvious reasons. So this specific type of behavior warrants additional considerations. Our first recommendation relates to the terminology we use around failures. It comes as no surprise that the term failure has negative connotations associated with it, but combining a positive term with the word failure, such as improving or learning, can make a big difference in destigmatizing the term failure. And it also does it without sacrificing clarity on what we're talking about. So terms like improving through failure and lessons learned from failure were both well understood in our experiments and had a positive connotation. So in general, using this type of framing called gain framing has the potential to evoke more positive responses from family planning professionals. And so gain framing in this context is combining a term that conveys failure as an opportunity for growth or improvement. So for example, when we're communicating and messaging around FailFest events, we can say things like, come and share how you've improved through failures, or reflect on your failures to learn and grow for them. Simple tweaks like that could make a difference. We also recommend avoiding terms that were shown to have negative connotations in our experiment. And some of these are actually pretty prevalent in our field. I've been seeing them more and more in different spaces, things like pitfalls, flops, missteps. So, we might want to consider not using those terms and or pairing some positive terms with those terms. Our next recommendation relates to the finding that people were less likely to say they would share their failures if they knew there was going to be a Q&A session with the other participants. And so our recommendation here is not to avoid these interactive discussions altogether. Rather, we can provide various platforms and formats for health professionals to share their failures. So for example, that could be like a one-way type of information exchange where like we share certain failures on a website or a database and people can explore those on their own. But I think there's still value in having interactive discussion forums. And as we start to shift the norms around sharing of failures, we're going to have some early adopters who show up for these interactive sessions and some others who may not be quite ready for that. And that's okay. Shifting norms takes time, but we can start to move the needle by creating safe spaces for people to share those failures and provided some great examples of how we can frame the discussion on failures in a positive way with curious questions that really don't point fingers or place blame on people. And finally, we did not find any significant differences in people's intention to share failures if they were provided with either social norms or self-efficacy or incentives framing. So we think that could be due to the ingrained stigma associated with sharing failures. But on the other hand, it could be due to the small sample size, the relatively small sample size we had in this particular experiment, or to the format of the experiment, which required participants to provide their response in an email format. So therefore, we think that further exploration into different types of behavioral nudges to motivate sharing of failures is warranted. So with that, we'd like to open it up now for questions from our audience. And thank you. We've been seeing those questions come in the chat. So we'll turn now to those questions and start answering them. So the first question I will give to Mariam. So Mariam, there was a question here about the hypothetical situation in the general information sharing experiment, the first one. The question is, it would have been better if done in the real world rather than hypothetical situations. Why didn't you enroll real partners instead of hypothetical ones? So Mariam, can you take that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you asked it. So yes, our initial methodology was to have real partners playing with each other. So to have, not to have hypothetical partners, but to having pairs with real people. We actually plan to deploy this experiment just after the height of the pandemic. I think it was meant to run from early 2021. And as you understand, the pandemic really put we had to take a step back and see what would be the best approach in a post-pandemic world. And, we didn't want to put a strain on, in-person gatherings or, encourage in-person gatherings when people were trying to observe social distancing and things like that. So our in-person experiments turned to remote experiments. And with remote experiments, we had initially thought of pairing people, in different regions and different countries, but then, time zones come into play. And also there are issues of, the number of people that we're able to recruit remotely. So we found that when we tried to deploy the experiments remotely, we had a lot of imbalances in the number of people in the various countries that we were recruiting in. And so trying to pair people online was quite challenging because they have to select a time, they have to stick to that time. But when you run experiments in person, it's much easier because the people that come in for a session, you automatically pair them. But with online experiments, it's difficult to get people at particular times. So to limit the logistical barriers in pairing people with actual partners, that's why we chose to use hypothetical partners. But you're absolutely right. Our initial methodology was to have people, to have centers in the different countries that we were operating in, and basically have people come in and participate in the experiment and be paired with someone. But unfortunately, the fact that doing this remotely, there are a lot of challenges in getting people to engage at the right time and also engage, and also find people that are available to engage in the different countries online.
Thanks so much, Mariam. And while you have the mic, I'll like to pass another question to you. There was a question about any insights on the age factor in terms of information sharing.
Yeah, that's a good one. No, so our experiments focused only on the gender component. We could have tried to break down our insights by age, but as we mentioned before, the fact that we deployed these experiments remotely meant that our sample size was much smaller than we had initially envisioned. And the more you break down your analysis by different groups or different variables, the less likely that you are to detect an effect. So we try to limit the number of variables by which we're splitting the data up and trying to assess impact. So we prioritized mostly gender, and also we prioritize the various gender components for each of the experiments. So same gender versus different gender.
Great, thanks for clarifying, Mariam. And yeah, it would be interesting to look at the age factor in other experiments. Next question, I'll turn to Anne. And there's a question here. I'm interested in whether you would think there would be a difference in the types of failures shared with the different approaches. In my recent experience of asking for people to share failures in programs for women and girls' health, in some instances, I get a really strong bias towards sharing resource failures, for example, not having enough motorbikes instead of approach failures. So Anne, do you have any insights around that based on your experiences with what people are sharing in your FailFests?
Yes, I do. And I'm sure others have experiences to add as well, but we have found that as well. So what we've done to kind of get around that is laying some ground rules at the beginning of the event or at the beginning of the discussion. And one of the ground rules that we use is that the failure has to be something you were personally involved in. So this kind of, then people don't necessarily talk about failures that they weren't involved in. And we also say it should be a failure at the program level instead of like a global failure or a failure to not yet have achieved the Sustainable Development Goals or something broader like that. So it's really important that the failure be something that that individual was personally involved in.
Great, thank you, Anne. Back to Mariam. There was a question here about drop-offs. So maybe people dropping off had an impact on the outcomes of the experiment. Also, having the same experiment in person may yield different results. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, absolutely. We did have some drop-off, and it definitely does affect, how likely we are to detect effects for the different treatment groups. And then you can't, predict, how many people will engage in each of the treatment groups. So you have varying samples for each. So you're absolutely right. I think there is, as Ruwaida said, the recommendations show that there is, although there are great insights that we've learned and that can be, easily applicable and can be readily deployed in, how knowledge success curates its solutions, how they improve their solutions, how they adapt their solutions. There's also a lot of scope to explore additional work, investigating, for example, other forms of recognition, testing out other ways to encourage sharing behavior in terms of how we frame failure. So there is scope for, a lot of additional work, and we hope that we can do this work in person to some extent. I feel that there's a lot of great work going on, and we hope that we can continue to iterate because as we mentioned, this is just a snapshot in time. The dynamic of human behavior keeps changing, so it'd be interesting to see how what kind of interesting results we get with future experiments.
Great, thank you, Mariam. And I see a lot of chatter in the chat box about failures and sharing of failures. So it's great to see all your own insights in the chat. So thank you for sharing that. There was one question here that I think I'll pass to Neela if you have any insights based on previous research. How can we go about sharing information about taboo topics with certain communities? Do you have any insights there about how we can go about sharing information on taboo topics?
Yeah, no, I think it's great, and it's very related to sharing information about failures, right? These are things that are risky, that put us in a position of vulnerability. So actually one point I was going to make is that when we're looking at things that have worked in sharing failures, we should also actually look at things that have worked in sharing vulnerability. How do people share HIV status? It's the same degree of vulnerability as when we're talking about, even greater, in fact. What works, what doesn't work, how do you frame things? In terms of coming back to the question about, sharing risky information, one way is obviously sort of mass blanketing things may not work as well, but coming back to social norms and social groups and letting people know that, this information is other people have been asking this information and other people have a point of view is important. And it brings me to mind this really interesting study in Saudi Arabia with women's workforce participation. As we know, in Saudi Arabia, because of the concept of guardianship, men often have a final say in their wives' labor force participation. And what happened was that most men, actually, researchers found, had very positive beliefs about their wives working, but they thought other people had negative beliefs. And so then they wouldn't actually sign on to have their wives work or outside the home. And as a result of which, female labor force participation is very low. So what the researchers did is they actually just gave people information that most people think like you. And that really led to an increase in the sort of allowing, female labor force participation. So in many cases, it's really just giving people the information, and obviously this is done in small groups, that other people think like you are not alone in this. And that's one way maybe to think about this information. Another way that we've seen in immunization, which obviously is much less risky, but it really plays to the importance of who spreads this information in a group. So in that study, what they found, what they called quote unquote, and that's researchers' own words, gossips. And I mean gossips in a good way. In any group, there are people who always know what's going on. They're not necessarily your leaders. They're not necessarily the elected formal leaders or the people who have necessarily, the most unofficial leadership. They're just the people that know everything about what's going on. And if you can recruit them to spread the word, then the word spreads much faster than if you just were to, say, get the village leader to talk about something. So it really points to the fact that messengers are very important, but those messengers need not always just be people in a position of authority. So I'd really encourage us to think about sort of creative ways of small group discussion, letting other people just know that, other people are also asking the same questions. You are not alone. And I think that has very strong parallels to sharing information about failures.
That's really interesting, Neela, and I like that framing of the gossips. So yeah, definitely heard a lot about messenger effects, and we tend, I guess, just to close, there's a question in the chat that came in about the role of donors in improving sharing of failures. So perhaps that could play an important role as the leadership and being the messengers, but maybe it's other people too who, you know, are very well connected and have a good social network. So we are at time. We only have a couple minutes left for our scheduled webinar, so we want to respect everyone's time. And thank you all for the great discussion and the great questions. We will be sharing a recording of this webinar, and we will be following up also with a link to our final report. Some people have asked about the final report, and we will be posting that on our website in the next couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that. And thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.